Welcome to the channel. My name is Vanessa Cara-Kerr, and in this series we're going to be talking about underwater filming tips. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. The bell button must be somewhere down here, and you'll be notified when we release further episodes. Just for the record, all the equipment that is shown in this video is not sponsored. It has been purchased by myself. Let's dive right into it. But before that, one thing, t-shirt. That's better. This episode is about underwater camera housings. This is the Nauticam housing for the Panasonic GH4 and this one is for the Panasonic GH5. First off, you're going to have to find out which manufacturers actually provide a housing for your camera model, and then you can start to compare the different options. If you use a compact camera, you're most likely going to be limited to plastic housings. If you use, for example, a mirrorless camera or DSLR, you're going to have a wider range of housings and materials to choose from. And as a side note, there are manufacturers out there that provide universal housings. Usually those housings will fit different camera models, even different manufacturers. In most cases, these universal housings are a bit bulkier and bigger due to the fact that they have to fit different camera models. Let's talk about the materials that the different housings come in. The most common ones are polycarbonate, which is a stronger kind of plastic, aluminium housings, and some even come in carbon fiber. The main difference between those materials are durability, depth rating, and price. Plastic housings tend to be a lot cheaper, and aluminium housings tend to be pretty expensive. The plastic housings tend to be less durable than the aluminium housings, just due to the fact of the material. The overall build quality of aluminium housings tend to be way better. They provide smooth operation of the camera controls, like the focusing and the zoom knob and the shutter release button. Depending on the type of diver you are, you're going to have to check the depth rating of your housing. The depth rate can be anything between 10 and 120 or more meters. So if you are a technical diver, you're going to need a housing that has a higher depth rate. But if you're a recreational diver or a diver that just tends to dive in shallower waters, you don't need a housing that is depth rated to 120 meters. But to be sure, don't push the limits of the depth rating of your housing. There are a number of things that can happen when you exceed those limits. The buttons may not work anymore, the housing will start to leak, and in worst case, the housing will break totally or implode due to the pressure underwater. If you want to be on the safer side, just stay below the depth rating. I'd recommend you to get a housing that actually exceeds your average diving depth. So if you do choose to dive deeper at some point or become a technical diver, you're not limited by the depth rating of your housing. Now let's talk about ports. It will essentially depend on the camera model and on your budget. If you have a compact camera, the ports will not be interchangeable, so will be fixed to the housing. If you're using a mirrorless system or DSLR, then you will have interchangeable port systems. Make sure the manufacturer actually provides the ports you need for the lenses that you want to use. The manufacturers have port charts on the website, and there you can check if their ports are compatible with the lenses you want to use. There are two types of ports. There are dome ports and there are flat ports. The dome ports have a curved glass or curved acrylic, and the flat ports are flat. The curved dome ports are for wide-angle fisheye and for wide-angle zoom lenses. The flat ports are usually for macro lenses. If you're looking for higher quality ports, make sure that the manufacturer provides glass ports. Glass ports are more expensive than acrylic ports, but are better quality. The other option would be to check if the housing is compatible with third-party port manufacturers. But we'll dive deeper into this in an upcoming episode. To make the lens work with your port, you're going to need zoom and focus rings. Be sure the manufacturer provides zoom and focus rings for the lenses you want to use. You will need those to operate the zoom and the focus of your lens with the port and your housing. Depending on the type of lens that you're going to use, you may just need the focus ring. If you have, let's say, a wide-angle lens or a fisheye lens, you're just going to need the focus ring. But if you want to use a wide-angle zoom lens, you're going to need a focus and a zoom ring. This is a wide-angle zoom lens, so you have the focus ring and the zoom ring. So you want to be able to operate the two. Now, some combinations of ports and housings just allow one of the two. In this case, the dome port has the focus knob attached to it. So you can use this to focus and you can use the housing knob to zoom. Make sure you have this in mind when you're choosing a setup. Some ports may not have the extra knob. In those cases, you can buy extension rings that have the knob attached to them. The best way is to discuss this with your underwater camera store to see what are the best options for the lenses you want to use. Another important aspect is maintenance and repair. There's no point in having the best housing if you cannot have it serviced and repaired easily. So make sure you have a camera store that can service and repair your housing in a short period of time. Sooner or later, things will break and it will need to be replaced. Sometimes you can fix it yourself, but sometimes you just can't. Just keep that in mind. There are things you can do to prevent failures. After every dive, visually inspect the O-rings of the housing if there's any sand or any dirt or debris on it, and remove it. And if the O-rings are too dry, just add a bit of silicone grease to the O-ring that is provided by the housing manufacturer. I would always recommend using the silicone grease which is provided by the manufacturer because it's specifically made for the O-rings. When I film in sandy areas or muck dive sites, I clean the O-ring every time I open the housing and I re-lubricate the O-rings every time too. The O-rings are a very important part of the housing. They seal the housing. Be sure to maintain them properly and replace them every now and again because they are your camera insurance. If the O-rings have some sort of an issue, the housing may leak. Getting spares for the crucial parts of your housing can be essential. When you're in remote locations, you may not have access to an underwater camera store, or even if you're at the dive site and your O-ring breaks, then you want to have a spare O-ring with you. The spare parts that I tend to bring with me are O-rings, silicone grease, HDMI cables for inside the housing, HDMI cables that connect to the outside monitor, but more on that in a future episode. Talking about failures of the housings, most manufacturers provide vacuum seals and leak alarm systems. The vacuum system creates a vacuum and seals the housing at all times. And the leak alarm system, sets off when your housing starts to leak. In most cases, the systems will have a LED light that will start to blink and a beeping noise. So when you're diving underwater, you will most certainly be notified if your housing starts to flood. Some housings come directly with those systems and some housings you're going to have to buy it extra. But it's definitely worth buying. It will give you a peace of mind when you're diving underwater and filming. And a very nice side effect of those vacuum seals is it removes all the air from the housing. It's going to prevent the housing from fogging up from inside. Usually this happens when you open the housing in a warm environment and then you close it again and then you go diving in cooler waters. But we're going to dive deeper into this topic in a future episode. Now we're going to come to very important parts of the housing, the controls of the housing. It's the little details that make a big difference. Things like, how is the layout of the buttons on the housing? How do the buttons feel when you press them? What material are the buttons made of? How are the mechanics of the buttons? Are your most used features on the camera supported by the housing? Are they easily accessible? Are they placed well? For example, ISO, white balance, shutter speed, aperture, shutter release. How do the zoom and focus knobs feel? Do they turn smoothly? With the universal housings, the button layout will most likely not be the same layout as on your camera. This is just due to the fact that the housing is universal and can fit different types of cameras. The button of these housings will usually trigger the camera settings via USB connection or Wi-Fi connection. But with housings specifically designed for your camera, you're going to have mechanical buttons. So when you press the button on the back of the housing, it's actually going to press the button on the camera. So there's no need to connect the housing to the camera like the universal housings. It doesn't matter if you choose a universal housing or a custom housing, you should be able to operate the housing without losing a sturdy grip. So this will depend on ergonomics and how the housing is built. And one important fact is, if you're a cold water diver, be sure that you can operate the housing with gloves. Every manufacturer has their own design in trays, handles, and connections. The housing should sit nice in your hands without it hurting or without you losing grip. The handles come in totally different shapes and in different materials. This is something that you're just going to have to try out for yourself, what feels best for you. In most cases, you will have the option to configure the placement of the handles. And there's another important part of the housing, and that's the connectors. For instance, the ball heads. To those you will attach the floats, and the floats will help you trim the buoyancy of the housing underwater. And to those floats, you're going to attach your video lights, but this we're going to cover in a future video. So just make sure that you have enough options to mount floats to your housing. And bear in mind that maybe in the future you want to add an underwater monitor. So you're going to need a connection and a mounting option for that. To make sure these options are available, it's best to talk to your underwater camera store or talk to the manufacturer directly. So to summarize, how do you know what is the best underwater housing for you? Do some research on the different manufacturers and the housing models with your camera in mind and the type of diving you want to do. If you're going to use different camera models, maybe a universal housing is best for you. But if you're only going to use one camera model, maybe a custom housing is best for you. It will also depend on the quality of the housing and the ports that you want to use. If there is an underwater camera store nearby, go and visit them and try out the different models. And I strongly recommend to visit a dive show or a dive fair. You can go and compare all the models with each other, and you can actually physically test the models. And if you have any questions, the manufacturers are there and you can talk to them. But the most important is just to test the housing. At the end of the day, it's not only the facts that matter, it's how the housing feels and works for you. You just need to try it out. That's the best way to find out. And lastly, of course, it's going to depend on the budget you have or want to spend on the system. So this is it. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful to you. As always, this is just my opinion. There are for sure plenty of ways to choose the right housing out there. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. If you've chosen a system already, I'd be interested to know which one you did and why. Safe diving, and I hopefully will see you in the next episode.